In this tutorial, we'll be adding buttonholes and buttons to our casual shirt. To start, we'll need to measure and mark the placement of the buttonholes. If you're adding buttonholes to a shirt with a separate placket, then both the buttons and the holes will be centered on the placket, and the preferred diameter of the buttons will be half that of the width of the placket. So a 1-inch wide placket will receive 1/2-inch buttons and holes, which will also be placed a 1/2 inch inward from the finished edge of the placket, which is right in the center of the placket, as well as on the true center front line of the shirt. Our casual shirt is finished with a facing rather than a separate placket, so it can sometimes be a little trickier to determine the placement of the buttons and buttonholes. When closed, the ends of the convertible collar should meet, and the point at which they meet is the center front line of the garment. So that is where we will position our buttons and buttonholes. I'm going to come in and measure the distance from the edge of the facing to the end of the collar at the neckline. So that's from this little corner right here to where the collar meets the neckline. I'm getting 5/8 of an inch for that measurement. So that is how far in from the edge of the facing we will be marking everything. That also means that 5/8 of an inch is the ideal diameter for our buttons. Though, as a designer, you're welcome to choose buttons of a different size based on the desired aesthetic. You would not, however, want to change the placement of the buttons and holes, as this would also change the fit of the garment. Before actually marking the holes, you'll need to determine which side they will go on. Traditionally, women's garments close in the front with the right side of the garment on top, and men's with the left side on top. As a unisex garment, this shirt can actually go either way, but for the sake of our demonstration, I'm going to treat it as a men's shirt with the left side on top, which means that that is the side that will receive the buttonholes. While a classic dress shirt would have buttons all the way up the neck and onto the collar stand, this casual shirt isn't intended to be worn buttoned all the way up to the top. We'll be placing our first button 6 inches down from the neckline, and each one that follows it will be spaced 3.5 inches from the previous one until we have a total of 5 buttons. Let's start by making a horizontal mark 6 inches down from the top of the neckline. So I'm going to put the 6-inch line of my ruler right at the top edge of the neckline and do a little horizontal mark right there. Now we'll continue to mark 3.5 inches down until we have a total of 5 marks. So from this first one, I'm going to now measure 3.5 inches and do a little horizontal mark and continue. 3.5 and mark. Three and a half, and mark. One more time, 3.5, and that will be the placement of our final button. Next, to indicate how far in from the facing edge our buttonholes will be, we'll do a vertical cross mark on each one, 5/8 of an inch inward. Each of these cross marks will indicate the top of the vertical buttonhole. So I'll come to this mark, place my ruler with the 5/8 line on the edge of the facing, and do a cross mark, almost creating like a letter T, since our buttonhole will start at the top and extend downward. We don't have to worry about the exact length of this mark, as we'll be using a one-step automatic buttonhole process, and the length will be decided for us as we sew on the machine after setting it properly. So come to the next one, 5/8 of an inch in, and mark. Each of our cuffs will also be receiving a button and buttonhole. To mark the buttonholes on the cuffs, come to the top layer of the overlap of your placket, and we want to do a cross mark that is 1/2 inch in from the edge This is where our buttonhole will begin. And we want to then do a cross mark halfway up the width of the cuff. Our cuff is 2 1/4 inches in width, so that means we want to mark 1 1/8 up from the bottom edge. Draw a horizontal line that crosses the first 1/2 inch mark that we drew. Our buttonhole will now begin at this cross mark of the letter T and extend horizontally on the cuff. Different machines may have different types of buttonhole feet and ways they need to be set up, so you'll want to check the manual on your machine to be sure exactly what type of settings it desires. But the type I have on this machine is a quite common one, called a one-step automatic buttonhole. This is the buttonhole foot, and it'll take the place of the standard presser foot I have on the machine now. But before I switch it over, I need to set the size of the buttonholes I'm trying to sew. This is done by taking one of the actual buttons I am using. I'm going to place it in this little section on the back of the foot and adjust the slider to clamp the button in place. This is how the machine will know how large to stitch the holes. Next, I'll remove my standard presser foot. Usually there's a little springy button on the back to push and release it. And I'm going to replace it with the buttonhole foot. So I'll place the little bar here underneath the ankle of my machine and lower the presser foot lever to bring it down on top of the buttonhole foot. And it should snap right in place. Additionally, most machines also have a special little lever that needs to be pulled down from above. It's usually a little bit hidden, but when you bring it down, you'll see that there tends to be a picture that looks like a buttonhole. I'm going to grab this lever and pull it down. See it right there? And the lever should sit behind the little tab on the buttonhole foot. Having this lever in place is what engages the buttonhole foot with the machine. Lastly, I want to set my machine to the preferred buttonhole stitch. Some machines may have more than one type of buttonhole stitch, but I'm going to go with a standard rectangular buttonhole. Before sewing your buttonholes, there's still a couple other things we want to be sure to do. Usually when you sew, you want to be sure that the upper thread coming out of the needle is underneath the presser foot. A standard presser foot will usually have a little slit in the front that you can direct the thread into, but a buttonhole foot usually doesn't have a slit. The thread needs to be brought down through this hole right here. So the best way to do that is to turn your hand wheel towards you to bring the needle down and back up, kind of like you're trying to draw up your bobbin thread. But now, see how the thread is pulled down through the hole? I can come in with any sort of tool that can get under there and just swipe it through. So now my upper thread from the needle is going down through the hole and out underneath the buttonhole foot. Also, it's important to take note of which direction your machine wants to sew the buttonholes. Some will start and sew backwards to create the buttonhole, and others will start and move forward to create the buttonhole. Mine sews backwards from my starting point, so since the marks on my garment indicate the top of the buttonholes, I want to position my garment accordingly. See how if I bring my garment in here, I have it placed upside down so that as I start to sew at the cross mark, that's kind of like the letter T, my machine will stitch backwards, meaning it will go downward to create the buttonhole from the starting point. If your machine sews in the opposite direction, then you'll want to flip your garment around. Next, I'll place the garment underneath the presser foot, and I want to perfectly align my cross mark of the letter T right in the center of the hole. So my horizontal mark is going right crosswise this way, and then the long vertical line of the T is centered and in line with the needle. Once it's positioned like that, you will lower your presser foot lever. And after lowering the presser foot in place, all I have to do is hold my foot on the foot controller and the machine will stitch the entire buttonhole for me, even automatically stopping at the end when it's complete. A tip for making this go smoothly, since sometimes buttonholes can be a little finicky, is to not sew them at top speed, despite how automatic this process kind of is. I know it could be a little bit exciting to want to floor it as you're stitching your buttonholes, but sometimes they can get a little tripped up and stuck in place when you're sewing super duper fast. So take it at a moderate speed so your machine can keep up with all those excessive stitches. Additionally, make sure your fabric can move freely up and back and that your garment isn't getting hung up on any part of the machine. With all that said, here we go. I'm just going to hold my foot on the pedal and watch the magic happen. Mine starts by just moving backwards, and then when it's long enough, it's gonna come back forward again. And now it goes up and back to stitch the first side of the buttonhole. Then it's gonna come up the other side. That's the bar tack at the top. Back down the other side. And it's gonna finish by doing a bar tack at the end. And I'm gonna keep holding my foot on the pedal because it should stop automatically. Be sure that you don't release the foot pedal too soon. If you don't let the machine fully complete the buttonhole, then when you go to sew the next one, it's gonna start to finish the remaining buttonhole rather than starting a brand new one. So now that I'm done, all I have to do is raise my needle, raise my presser foot, and I should have a nice, perfectly sewn buttonhole. I'm going to cut the threads and repeat this process 4 more times to stitch all my remaining buttonholes. After sewing the buttonholes down the front of the shirt, move on to complete the ones on the cuffs as well. After all of your buttonholes are sewn, go ahead and snip all the loose threads away. You can clip them pretty close to the surface of the fabric because buttonholes tend to be pretty secure. So I'm going to come in from both sides and cut all the threads away. The next thing we need to do to turn these rectangular stitch lines into actual buttonholes is to cut them open right through the center of the stitches. The best tool to use for this is actually a seam ripper. We're going to be taking the pointed end of the seam ripper and stabbing it into the fabric and then carefully sliding it forward to use this blade that's right in the crook of it here to cut the fabric. The safest way to do this, rather than starting at one end and going all the way to the other and being sure you stop in time, it's much better to start at each end and go and meet in the center. That way you're sure to not overcut it, because the last thing you want is for your blade to cut past the bar tack at either end. So it's much easier to start at both of them rather than trying to stop at them. So I'll take my seam ripper and poke it right between the 2 rows of stitches and angle it. Be sure you really kind of brace your fabric and hold it taut, and see how I can slide it forward, and I've now cut this portion of the fabric. Now I'm going to repeat the same thing from the opposite direction and meet at the middle. Stab it in and carefully slide. And now we have an opened up buttonhole. Repeat the process for all 5 of them. The buttons on the opposite side of the shirt will also be 5/8 of an inch in from the facing edge, but height-wise, they will be centered in the middle of the buttonholes you have already created. Typically, the opening of a buttonhole is made to be 1/8 of an inch larger than the button. So for our 5/8 of an inch button, this space between the bar tack at the top and the bottom is actually 3/4 of an inch long, meaning 3/8 of an inch up from the bottom or down from the top will be the center. To mark this, position the 2 sides of the shirt with the facing edges matched, but not overlapping. Make sure the necklines and the hemlines down at the bottom are also aligned. You're going to use your ruler to measure up 3/8 of an inch from the bottom of each hole, basically right in the center, and we're going to hold the ruler straight across to make a horizontal mark on the opposite side of the shirt. So if I look at this one right here, I can hold my ruler sideways, and I'm measuring 3/8 of an inch upward from where that bar tack ends. So right in the center of the buttonhole is where I have the edge of my ruler. But then over on the opposite side of the shirt, I'll make a little horizontal mark straight across from it. And I'm going to repeat that mark for all of the buttons. So holding it right in the center of the buttonhole, straight across, make a horizontal mark. Then measure inward 5/8 of an inch from the facing edge to make a cross mark on each button mark. Our buttons will be sewn onto the center of each of these cross marks. So from right here, I'm going to measure 5/8 of an inch inward and do a vertical cross on the mark I already have. So each one's like a little plus sign. To mark the button placement on the cuff, you'll make a small cross mark at the same measurements we did for the buttonhole. Come to the underlap of the cuff and you'll mark 1/2 inch in from the edge, as well as 1 1/8 up from the bottom. And when we sew our button, it will be centered on that cross mark. I'm going to be demonstrating button sewing with a standard 2-hole button. To start, you'll take a hand sewing needle and your thread of choice. We're going to be threading our needle 4-ply, meaning 4 threads thick. This will reduce how many times we need to loop around the button, so you get a strong button in less time. So I'll take my thread, and I want to sort of fold my thread in half, see how I bring the end downward, and make this portion up to where you're folding the thread be about 12 inches long. I'll take that thread, kind of pinch it into a fold, and this doubled end of the thread is what I have to run through the eye of the needle. So take that little looped folded end and just push it right through the eye of the needle. And then you're taking that end and bringing it back down to where the end of your thread is, okay? So then come up to the needle and also smooth all those threads downward so they're the same length. I'm gonna cut everything off right about here, and this is where I'm going to tie my knot. Ultimately, you want this entire 4-ply thread section to not really be any longer than 8 inches or so. Even if it's only long enough to get 1 or 2 buttons sewn before you have to rethread it, it's less likely to get tangled if you keep your sewing thread short, rather than trying to make a big old long 4-ply thread. So at the bottom here, because it's so thick, I can usually get away with just tying 1 single knot, and that'll be enough. So tie your knot, and then clip the excess thread about a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch away from that knot. Now, for this 2-hole button, we're going to be orienting the holes on the button to be in the same direction as the buttonhole that we've stitched, meaning since we have vertical buttonholes, we will place these 2 holes vertically as opposed to orienting them horizontally. So they'll go in this direction. I want to come over to my mark here, and your button is ultimately going to be centered exactly on your cross mark. One of the great things about this process, though, is we're going to sew this in a way that makes it so we don't have a big, ugly knot of thread visible on the back of the garment. We're actually going to have the knot of our thread, both the beginning and end points, hidden between the button and the front side of the fabric. So you're actually going to start sewing from the top, believe it or not. I want to come to my cross mark, and rather than bringing my needle right into the center, I want to come about a 1/16 of an inch down from it, push my needle in, so I'm going all the way through to the bottom, and I bring it back up so that I'm catching about 1/8 of an inch of fabric here. Basically, the distance between where the needle goes down and up should be about the same as the space between the holes on your button. And we're just going to pull that right on through. So see, here's our knot right on the top side of the fabric. Next, you'll bring your needle up through the back side of the button into the first hole. And then we'll bring our needle down through the lower hole of the button and then down through the beginning of where I started sewing, right where the knot is, which is just a tiny bit below the center of your cross mark. And when I bring that through, you've basically created a circular loop of thread that comes down underneath the garment, up and around the button, and back through. Pull it tight until the button sits gently snug against your fabric. Now, from the back side, we're going to come back up through that upper sewing point, which is aligned with the upper buttonhole. And then we go back down through the lower buttonhole. And now we're going to loop around one more time. So ultimately, you've made a circular loop of thread, and we're going to do about 3 of those total. So up through the top, down through the bottom. Because we did this 4-ply trick with our thread, those 3 loops will be enough to give us a really secure button. If your thread was only 2-ply, as in 2 threads thick, you'd have to go around it about 6 times for it to be nice and secure. So once we've done our complete rotation of sewing, we're ready to finish it off. So we're going to take our needle and bring it right up through the upper sewing point again, but rather than coming all the way through the button, we're going to pull the button back and bring our needle up through the space between the back of the button and the front side of your shirt. So I'm going to pull that through. Now my thread is coming out from between the button and the top side of the shirt. To avoid having the button sit too tightly against the shirt, we're going to be doing something called shanking the button, which will slightly elevate it from the surface of the garment and actually make it easier to fasten. So I want to hold my garment flat, grab my thread nice and tight, and I'm going to wrap it around the base of my stitches underneath the button. Once, twice. And in doing so, you'll see that your button kind of lifted away from the surface of the garment a little bit. Now we're ready to finally tie it off. And just like when we started, we want our knot to be hidden between the button and the garment. So pull the button back and get right in here to where you see all your stitches coming through. Take your needle and just sew through a little bit of that thread so you're catching some of the stitches. But rather than pulling the needle all the way through, we bring the needle past that point, and we're going to take our needle and bring it up through the loop of thread we have here and pull it nice and tight. Repeat that process one more time. So I sew through the chunk of threads and then bring my needle through the loop and pull. We've now created a nice, secure knot that will hold our button in place. After knotting it, you can then come and clip your excess thread away about 1/8 of an inch from where the knot is. And when you're finished, you have a beautifully sewn button that looks clean on both the front and the back. And now you repeat this process for all remaining buttons. After your buttons are sewn on, you're ready to fasten them into the holes. Your casual shirt is now complete and ready to wear.